by the Klan because of his activism, his anti-racist activism. And so I sort of not only talk about that scene when his father was killed, but also I talk about what that actual intersection looks like today. There's like a car dealership there. And nobody would know who's walking by or driving by or who's buying cars that a lynching potentially happened there in 1931. Um, or other scenes I talk about, like when Malcolm X becomes a minister in Harlem for the Nation of Islam. And in 1957, Malcolm X is just one of many ministers of small congregations. It just so happened that his congregation practiced a form of Islam as sort of articulated by someone by the name of Elijah Muhammad. And he found out that one of his members was brutalized by the police at the corner of 125th and Lenox Avenue in Harlem. I hear that I'm in the Harlem of the West, but that's the Harlem of the East. And so Malcolm is told. And so the Nation of Islam, at that time, each mosque had a small sort of group of black men that they called the Fruit of Islam. And this was a group of black men that were trained to defend black people. So the Nation of Islam preached what was known as self-defense. And Malcolm X was misrepresented as somebody who was violent. But in actuality, he was against Ku Klux Klansmen and police and other engaging in violence against black people. He encouraged black people to defend themselves. And why was that something that was why was he so passionate about that? Because again, as I mentioned earlier, he believed his father was killed by the Ku Klux Klan. And so in this moment, one of his members actually stands up for another person who's being brutalized by the police, literally in the heart of Harlem, in the middle of the day. And so then the police start beating on him. His name is Johnson. And beats him so bad his brain starts bleeding. And as many of you know, if your brain starts bleeding, you can die. But instead of the police bringing Johnson to the hospital, they bring Johnson to the precinct and throw him in a cell. And so Malcolm is told that one of his members has been beaten and taken to the cell. So he comes to the precinct and brings the Fruit of Islam. The Fruit of Islam line up in formation, literally outside of the precinct, while Malcolm goes in. He, of course, goes to the counter, says, "I want to see Johnson." The lieutenant there says, "I don't know who you're talking about. We don't have somebody by that name." He asked the police officer to look outside. The police officer looks outside and sees these men lined up, and then see Harlemites behind them who are outraged because they've heard about the beating as well. To make a long story short, they decide to let Malcolm see Johnson. Malcolm sees Johnson, demands that the police take him for medical attention. Then the police decide that they're going to bring him to the hospital, so they put him in an ambulance, and the ambulance starts going down Lenox Avenue towards Harlem Hospital. So Malcolm decides he's going to follow that ambulance. So he starts marching down Lenox Avenue in the middle of the street. The Fruit of Islam are walking and marching behind them, all in suits, and literally marching in military formation. Harlem is marching behind them. I call this the March on Harlem. And this incident is reported in the Amsterdam News. That was the black newspaper in Harlem. And that's really when Harlem first heard the name Malcolm X. And Lenox Avenue, where he marched, is now named Malcolm X Boulevard. And so Malcolm X would go on to become this global icon, encouraging black people to defend themselves against racist violence, encouraging black people to unite, encouraging Black people to gain control of their own communities, encouraging Black people to look in the mirror and see beauty, not think that there's anything wrong or inferior with you, encouraging Black people to recognize that the problem isn't Black people, the problem is racism. And he ultimately becomes one of the greatest prosecutors of American racism in history. And that's why we're still talking about him today. And so the book chronicles his life, and it's called Malcolm Lives, because his message is still living today. People who are engaging in anti-racist activism today are literally being inspired by Malcolm X. Okay, that was supposed to be 2 minutes, I'm sorry. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yes? Stand up.
I don't know if you already answered this, but what's the favorite book you wrote in?
What's the favorite big book that I've read? So, asking an author like what's their favorite book is like asking a parent with multiple children, like who's their favorite child. So it's a hard thing. So most parents will say, my baby is probably my favorite child, the youngest, right? So I'll say Malcolm Lives, since it's the youngest, since it literally just came out on Tuesday. Yes, sir.
Based on how the Black community view today, what made you want to speak to us? Based on how the Black community view today in Denver, what made you want to speak to us?
Well, I've had the opportunity to study the history of African Americans across the United States, and I've had the opportunity to study pretty pivotal places in which Black people have arrived and really developed themselves and built community and built sort of culture. And frankly, the 5 Points is, knowing as an historian, is one of the most iconic Black spaces in the United States. And Black Denver is. And so to be here to come and engage with each of you, I was just telling, I believe a trustee of this church that I've been to a lot of churches around this country and even the world, but this is one of the most beautiful churches, I've been to. So I feel like I'm sitting and standing in Black beauty and excellence, and that's really why I wanted to come.
What drives you to become an author?
So I actually, when I was in high school, I actually wanted to play basketball. I wanted to go to the NBA. I was a point guard. I crossed you out. He's like, no, you can't. No, I actually couldn't. I couldn't. But so I went to college, and when I was in college, I realized that I probably wasn't going to be able to go to the NBA. So I needed to do something else. And so I actually became interested in being a sports writer. So that's like somebody who writes for a newspaper or a magazine. They like cover the Denver Nuggets or Colorado Rockies, for a newspaper. And so I did that and interned in some places. And I realized after meeting many of the professional athletes that, they're actually just like us. So it became quite old very, very quickly. But I ended up writing a story on sports and racism. And that story became quite impactful. I saw the impact that story had. So then I started being like, hey, I want to write more about racism. And that, I think, is ultimately what led me to this place. Yes. Oh, right here. Sorry.
Okay. What inspired you to learn and write about Malcolm X and not somebody else? And how did you connect with his story?
Sure. So I'll mention 3 different reasons why I connected to his story. One is to be Black in the United States is to grow up and be fed ideas that there's something wrong with you, or that there's something wrong with your community, or there's something wrong with Black people. And Malcolm X, in particular, probably more than any other figure in American history, spoke to Black people and told Black people that there was nothing wrong with you, that there was nothing wrong with your community, and that there was nothing wrong with your people. And I remember him giving a speech in 1962 in Los Angeles, speaking to a crowd of Black people. And he's saying to Black people, who taught you to hate yourself? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose? Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin? Who taught you to hate? And so Malcolm constantly taught Black people to love themselves. And so for me, as a Black person, that's always been inspirational and powerful. Secondly, Malcolm engaged in an intellectual transformation. So the way he thought about the world and himself changed over the course of his life. So to give an example, he hated himself at one point in time. So when he was 15 years old and moved to Boston, he didn't like his kinky hair, so decided to get what at the time was called a conch. Yes, and why did he get a conch? He wanted to get a conch because he wanted to look like a white man. He felt the more he looked like a white man, the better he would look. He also decided to start dating white women, and not necessarily because he met a woman who happened to be white, who was nice. No, he specifically saw white women as superior and more beautiful than Black women. And so that was him when he was 15 and 16 years old. And he realized that those ideas needed to change. And so he started changing those ideas. And I admire people who have the courage to look at themselves and be like, you know what, the way I'm thinking about this is wrong. I'm gonna grow, I'm gonna change. And to me, that's what it means to be an intellectual, to constantly be rethinking the way we see ourselves in the world. Yes.
Has someone ever been racist to you, and if so, how did it impact you?
Is someone what?
Has someone ever been racist to you, and if so, how did it impact you?
So I wish that some of you, I wouldn't wish this on anybody. So you asked me if anyone's ever been racist towards me. If I was to open up any of my social media accounts right now, you'll see all sorts of slurs. You'll see all sorts of statements calling me stupid, calling me all different types of names, because I have the audacity to challenge racism, because I have the audacity to say that the only thing wrong with Black people is that we think something is wrong with Black people, because I have the audacity to challenge white people to want to revolutionize this country for the benefit of all of us. And so I'm constantly being attacked and smeared and called the N-word, and threats are made. But that's part of the job. And frankly, that's what Malcolm faced for most of his life.
In which ways do you believe your books and documentaries have influenced or empowered contemporary Black communities?
What I'm hoping, and I guess what people have told me is, I think it's allowed Black people to engage on their own journey, to be anti-racist, to challenge, to recognize that they are not the problem and Black people are not the problem, that racism is the problem. But then even in a greater sense, I feel like my work has helped Black people and even non-Black people to see racism. And we can't even challenge something or defeat anything we can't see. And racism looks differently in 2025 than it did in 1965. And oftentimes we're taught about white only signs in 1965, and we're not necessarily taught about policies and rules we can't even see that are excluding Black people today. So it's been important for me to give Black people and even other people the glasses so they can actually see the rules and policies that are hidden, that are making it harder for them to get ahead, that's making it more likely for them to be incarcerated, impoverished, dying of heart disease or cancer, or being expelled to school or being brutalized by the police.
As you were doing your research on the history of Black Americans, what were the things that you saw and read that made you question your own history and your lineage, and how did that keep you going, like motivated?
So one of the most fascinating things I learned was I actually changed my middle name. My middle name that my father gave to me, my mother actually didn't like this middle name, but she she actually named my brother his middle name. So then apparently it was my father's turn. So he named me Henry. Henry was my original middle name. And I see people already laughing at that name, so it's all good. And one of the things I learned in studying the history of racism is that a person by the name of Prince Henry actually pioneered what became known as the human trade of African people. And so it was the Portuguese who, in the mid 1400s, started basically going into Africa, kidnapping people, and bringing them first back to Europe and ultimately to the Americas. So what we came to be known as the transatlantic slave trade, it was the Portuguese who started that. And the person in Portugal who started that was this guy by the name of Prince Henry. So I learned that through my research. And so there was another reason why I didn't want to continue to have that name. And so I actually changed my name from Henry to Zolani. And Zolani is a Zulu name meaning peace. And one of the reasons why I changed the name from Henry to Zolani is because the human trade brought so much violence to Africa, to African people. You know, some estimates point to as many as 100 million Black people dying during the 4-century long transatlantic trade. And when I say 100 million, you're talking about Black people dying who are in their communities, and then their community is raided and they're killed. Or after they are captured, they're marched to the coast of Africa. And that march was an incredibly grueling march. Sometimes they marched 50 or 100 miles. They died. Or they were held in castles along the coast of Africa, waiting for ships to bring them over to the Americas. They died in those castles, or they died on those ships. And so there was so much violence that Prince Henry, in particular, started. And so what's the opposite of violence? Peace, right? And so I wanted my work and my being to help bring about peace for Black people, really bring about peace, for all people.
How do the recent book bannings affect you personally? And how do you think the bannings will affect the message of your books?
So I can answer the second one first. So I'm not allowing the book banning to affect the message of my books. I'm not sort of
sugarcoating anything. I'm not holding anything back. I'm not. I'm just going to tell the truth, whether people like it or not. And frankly, I'm using Malcolm X once actually said, "I'm going to tell the truth, whether people like it or not." In terms of the first question, I've actually had 8 different books of mine that have been banned, and my books have been banned all over the country. And so to me, it's impacted me very directly. And I've witnessed, I should say, I've seen some of the justifications for banning my books, and I've seen the ways in which people have literally misrepresented the books. Uh, so I write a book, for instance, called Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism in You with Jason Reynolds, which is probably my most banned book, along with How to Be an Anti-Racist. In that book, the central message is that we should all see each racial group as equals. The book banners claim that we were trying to essentially argue for racial hierarchy. Like, I mean, I don't know how they arrived at that. Or How to Be an Anti-Racist is a book that argues to be anti-racist is to not see any racial group as superior or inferior, whether that racial group is Black or white or Latino or Asian or Native, and that we should value and respect and not judge any person, based on their skin color, no matter whether their skin color is light or dark. And I challenge anyone who thinks that there's something wrong with Black people or white people or Latino people, any racial group, that's being racist, while to be anti-racist, right, is to recognize that we're all equal. But the book banners claim that anti-racist is code for anti-white. And in fact, that sort of term, I should say that phrase, that anti-racist is code for anti-white, actually was coined by a white supremacist. So those white supremacist ideas are now mainstream, unfortunately, being used to ban books by people who claim they're not white supremacists.
How do we as African Americans combat the internalized ideology of inferiority at this time?
Well, first, I think that I think Black people or African Americans also need to read books about racism. We need to read books about racist ideas, particularly anti-Black racist ideas. And why do we need to read those books? Why do we need to study that? Because how else are we going to recognize those ideas and unlearn those ideas? How else are we going to free ourselves of this internalization? And frankly, Malcolm X, he really brought to prominence this internalization. And he constantly challenged Black people who thought from what I would call an assimilationist perspective, in which you, as a Black person, you sort of normalize or you standardize white people, and then you essentially aspire to be that. He once said in a speech, speaking to Black people, you don't want to be Black, and they won't let you be white. So you're stuck. And so I think it's important for Black people to want to be Black, just like I think it's important for every group to want to be what they see in the mirror.
How would you define Black excellence?
How would I define Black excellence? I'm thinking about this just because excellence is a very subjective term. Y'all know what I mean by subjective. Like, who gets to determine what is excellent? And so I would sort of compare Black excellence to Black beauty. And so what I mean by that, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So you determine your own beauty. Like, you don't determine whether you're beautiful based on whether other people think you're beautiful or handsome. You determine whether you're beautiful. And so as it relates to excellence, I would say for a Black person to think for themselves, what does it mean for me to be excelling? And then I'm going to seek to achieve that. I'm gonna achieve that goal of excellence that I've set for myself. And that goal of excellence can be varied, and it's going to be different for every group of people. But that's how I would understand Black excellence. And let me just also add that I don't think it's important for Black people to be excellent in order to somehow prove to other people that we are equal to them. So, what Black people need to be in order to demonstrate that we're equal to other groups? Our imperfect selves. And you want to know why? Because if we're imperfect, that means we're human. And all groups are human, and all groups are imperfect. And so what makes the racial groups equal is not because, we somehow started being excellent. What makes Black people equal to other racial groups is because they're human and we're human. They're imperfect and we're imperfect. And I think the more we think about it in that way, particularly for young people, the more you think about it in that way, because when I was young, I thought that I was like carrying the race on my shoulder. Like I thought, okay, I don't want to sort of act right, or I want to excel because I don't want to let down Black people. I don't want, non-Black people to think that there's something negative about Black people because I'm acting negatively or because I did something that was wrong. When in fact, if you make a mistake or act negatively, and then someone who's not Black thinks negative thoughts about tens of millions of Black people, what they're thinking is the problem, not you.
What do you think is the most overlooked aspect of systemic racism, and what can we as a society do in today's political climate to fight against it?
I've received a lot of questions about racism, and I've never received that one. I would say the most overlooked aspect of systemic racism is how power actually operates to maintain this system. And the reason why I bring that up is because most people, when they think of racism, they're thinking about power, but they don't necessarily, you ask them, okay, how does power operate within racism? They'll say they typically don't know. So I think it's important for us to see and not overlook how power operates. And so power operates on two levels. So first, power operates in the sense of policy. So to give an example, a city or a state has rules that determine that schools are going to be funded based on local property taxes, which then allows those communities and neighborhoods with homes that are very expensive, that only rich people can afford, to be able to spend a lot of money on their schools. And then communities with neighborhoods where there are not expensive homes aren't able to spend as much money on their schools. So then it leads to this huge disparity in which you have these rich schools, you have rich people sending their kids to rich schools, and then you have low-income people sending their kids to low-income schools. And then some of those rich people are saying they believe in meritocracy and fairness. And then they say, well, if those Black kids who are disproportionately in those Low income schools are not getting into University of Denver or UCLA. They're at fault, not that policy. That's power. Power operates through rules and policies that actually govern how we live. Another way power operates is the individuals who literally make those policies and defend those policies, and the individuals who carry out those policies, and most importantly, all of us who can resist those policies. I would say I share your goal, that goal of helping others. And frankly, I agree with you that that is really the goal of being human. And I also think we are oftentimes taught to think that the more we help others, the more it hurts us. We're oftentimes taught that we should focus on only helping ourselves. And the more we help ourselves, the better. When in fact, that's anti-human. And it's not only anti-human, it's unintelligent. Why is it unintelligent? Because, for instance, if you don't think about what's best for the world, let's say you don't think, you only care about yourself, you don't care about the environment. So you don't care about the earth. You literally don't care about your literal house. What's going to happen? The earth is going to continue to warm. And as a result of that warming, there's going to be more and more natural disasters. And then more and more of those natural disasters are going to threaten your life. Or let's say, you know what? I don't actually care about, I'm Black, but actually, I don't really care about that other Black person who was brutalized by the police. They're not me. So what does that got to do with me? So then I don't engage in activism to prevent Black people from being brutalized by the police. 2 months later, I get pulled over and brutalized by that same officer. So it's just unintelligent. But I think in many ways we're taught these anti-human ideas. So I wish more people were taught the ideas that you have.
How did Malcolm X's speeches empower Black identity and pride in the 1960s?
So I'll just give one example, and I'm going to try to get more concise with my answer so we can get more questions in. You asked me how did his message impact Black identity? Before Malcolm X, no one who we would now consider to be Black, I should say very few people who we would now consider to be Black identified as Black. We identified as Negroes. And people specifically were like, I ain't Black. And why did they not want to identify with Black? Because Black was considered ugly. Black was considered negative. Black was considered lazy. Black was considered all these negative things. And Black and African Americans did not want to identify with that. And Malcolm X came along and challenged those ideas and argued that Black is beautiful. And that notion that Black is beautiful then, of course, became one of the soundtracks, really, of the Black Power movement that almost totally, that was largely inspired by Malcolm's message.
What do you think about the lack thereof black leaders, and what do you think we do about that to change that?
So there isn't necessarily in 1965, there was, for instance, a Martin Luther King Jr. who was considered a black leader, a preeminent black leader. In 1820, there was a Frederick Douglass who was considered a preeminent black leader. In 1910, Booker T. Washington was considered this preeminent black leader. And so today, I actually do think there are many black leaders. And now, are those black leaders getting the recognition that some of those three people received? No. Are many of those leaders women? So they cannot be, there are sort of sexist forces that don't allow them to be seen as a preeminent leader? Yes. Have many of these black leaders not been anointed by white America? Yes. And so I actually do think there are black leaders. And let me also say what I define as a leader. I define a leader as somebody who has the ability to not only recognize problems, but be willing to solve them. So like I direct a center, and I have staff, and I have two types of staff, not to overly simplify it. There are staff who are gonna come to me constantly with problems, and then there are staff who are gonna come to me with problems and solutions. And it is those staff who come with solutions who are leaders. And so I actually do think we have a lot of leaders, but I also think we need to support these leaders, because in this moment, many of those leaders are being smeared, are being attacked, are being defunded, are being undermined. And so it's incredibly important for us to support them.
I have one.
Sorry.
I got you. As an activist and a book author, right? My question is, how do you vision the world would be like? How do you vision we will accomplish equality? And I also got a follow-up question with that. Do you think that equality could be accomplished without violence?
So let me answer the second question first. Do I think it can be accomplished without violence? Of course, I think it can be accomplished without violence. Have there been revolutions that were nonviolent? To a certain extent, yes. But oftentimes, there's been ruling forces that have essentially sought to maintain racism through violence. And so that's why it makes it harder to be able to overcome this awesome amount of violence that seeks to maintain racism through violence. To give an example, during the abolitionist movement, most of the abolitionists were nonviolent. And of course, these were white people and black people who were advocating to eliminate slavery. Enslavers were the most violent people on earth. They literally kept people enslaved through terror. And so, unfortunately, they were not going to stop slavery unless something like a war happened. And so in this moment, can we eliminate racism through violence? I'm hoping that we can. I'm hoping that we don't have to have another civil war where more Americans died in the Civil War than all subsequent wars combined. I'm hoping we can actually have, a nonviolent transformation to this country. And how we would do that is, again, racism is a structure. It's a structure of policies and practices and rules that include and exclude people, that disadvantage and privilege people. And so to create equality, we need to renovate, take out all those inequitable rules and replace them with equitable ones. But not just that, we also have to systematically teach people racial equality so that when they see equity, they will expect equity among equal peoples. Right now, you have many Americans, when they see, let's say, Black people being more likely to be impoverished, they don't actually see a problem. Why don't they see a problem? Because they've been systematically taught that Black people are lazy, that Black people don't want to work, that Black people prefer welfare over work. If they were systematically taught that no racial group is lazier or prefers welfare more or is less business savvy, then when they saw those inequalities, they'd be like, hey, there's a problem here. So we also have to train people, educate people on the truth, of racial equality. That's why books in education become so critical. That's why many of the battles you see on television in our politics are over the way people think. Yes. Oh. Yes.
As far as racism across the world towards Black people, how does it differ from American racism? Or does American racism have a heavy influence on the rest of the world and the way they see Black America?
Man, I knew I'd come to Denver. Y'all would come with these questions. These last two questions were serious. So it's both. So in certain types of ways, anti-Black racism operates similarly across the world. And so, but there are profound differences also in different countries. So to give an example, in the United States, there is not necessarily considered to be, like, biracial people are not necessarily considered to be a separate, quote, racialized group. And biracial people, particularly those who are of African descent, are pretty much considered to be Black. In other countries, they are racialized differently. So like in South Africa, you have the colored population, right? And in Brazil, you have biracial people who identify themselves differently than, let's say, Black people. And so the reason why that is important is because even though in the United States, lighter skinned Black people are more likely to be employed or less likely to be incarcerated or less likely to be expelled from school than darker skinned Black people, there's still forms of racial solidarity that may not necessarily exist as much in other countries. And so again, race operates differently, and therefore racism operates differently in different countries. But then there are similarities, as well.
Okay. In your documentary, you talked about, you brought up how Black people were seen as savages and just being basically dehumanized by white people and stuff. So that leads me to the question: if the system was never made for us, do you think we'll ever break the cycle?
So the system indeed was not necessarily made for Black people. And I think also it's important for us to let's sort of use the term structure. So if you move into a new house, that new house wasn't necessarily made for you. But that doesn't necessarily mean you cannot gut renovate the house and completely transform it into a structure that is indeed made for you. And so I want us to understand you can have a structure that has maintained itself. So that house you moved into has pretty much been the same way since it was built. But when you go in there and you engage in activism, that doesn't mean that that structure has to stay the same. You can literally gut renovate it and transform it. And that's the power of activism. And that's the power of even envisioning what a different world, or in this case, a structure, could be.
As a black man in America, what were the repercussions you went through as you released Stamped and as you evolved as an author, leading you to make the Stamped documentary?
What are the repercussions? So, I mean, I mentioned to you earlier that it's hard to even open up my sort of mentions, on social media, because of comments that are constantly made. I've been framed in 2021. I was conceived of as the quote unquote father of critical race theory, which was news to me because critical race theory was birthed at Harvard in the late 1970s. I was born in 1982. So then, after sort of that started to die down and wokeism emerged, I was sort of framed as like, the guru of wokeism. And then I apparently became a DEI expert, which was news to DEI practitioners and executives, I should say officials, because I had actually never worked in a DEI office before. And so as a result, there's many people in this country who think of me as somebody who is trying to harm them as opposed to literally somebody who's trying to help them. And as a result, I've had to take all sorts of precautions in order to protect myself, and my family. But I've also had to realize I just can't take any of this personally because historically, specific Black people have been made into boogeymen to sort of cause people to fear change or to fear Black people or to fear racial justice. And I just so happen to be one of those boogeymen. And why? Because my work became popular. I should also add another repercussion that, I don't talk as much about is that you also have people, even within our community, who believe that because my work became popular, I must have sold out in some way. These are people who can't imagine, these are Black people who can't imagine that a Black person could actually write or create work that's good, and that's why people like it. And so they're deeply cynical of any sort of Black person who's actually trying to help Black people. And so I've also had to face smears and attacks from them as well. So it's been a lot, but it's not going to stop me, because this work is so important because I love Black people and I love human beings.
I have a question. When writing your book, How to Not Be an Anti-Racist, how did your understanding of racism evolve through the process of writing that book?
So that book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, I really wanted the book to show how I ended up internalizing these anti-Black racist ideas. Like I literally, when I was in high school, I grew up in the 1990s, or I should say I was in high school in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, there were all these ideas circulating that Black youth were the problem. So we were considered a menace to society, so much so they wrote a movie called Menace to Society. It was imagined that we were super predators, literally. A Princeton affiliated scholar wrote an essay calling Black youth super predators. And then you had Democrats and Republicans, politicians, saying that we were super predators. You had ideas circulating that Black girls were hypersexual and having all these babies because they wanted to get welfare. And there was all these ideas attacking, Black teenage mothers. And so whenever, and so people saw me as scary, as dangerous, just because I was young and Black. And so it was hard to not eventually start seeing myself as dangerous, as scary. And so really How to Be an Anti-Racist sort of talks about that, and then how I was able to realize that those ideas were dangerous and scary, not me. And it was hard to do that. And I learned through the course of writing that being anti-racist requires us to be deeply vulnerable and self-aware and self-critical, which are all the things people don't want to do and be. Because if you're Black, you want to believe you can't be racist, and if you're white, you want to believe you're not racist because you have a Black friend. And so it really allowed me to sort of see the depths, again, of vulnerability that we need to do and be. And I think it also gave me more empathy for people who are still struggling to essentially unlearn racist ideas, because I saw how hard it was for me.
If you could see Michael X, what would you see? What would you say?
If I could see Malcolm X, I would actually ask him, how did he become so fearless? Malcolm, as you'll read in Malcolm Lives, over the last year of his life, he faced constant threats to the point in which at one press conference, someone asked him, are you worried? Everyone's threatening you, threatening your life. He was worried about the Nation of Islam. He was worried about the US government. And he said, no, I don't worry. I don't fear anyone or anything. I live like a man who's already dead. And I think the reason why he said that, frankly, is because racism, it's hard to truly live in the midst of racism. And just like, for instance, in another speech, he said to Black people, because he talked about how he used to be in prison and he saw some Black people grumble. And he was like, don't get on me because I was in prison. If you Black, you're born in prison. And why? Because racism creates bars. Now, you can't necessarily see those bars, particularly in 2025, but that doesn't mean those bars aren't there, which holds you back. And so that's why he was literally in that speech, that people aren't even afraid to go to jail. That in the early 1960s, Black students who were protesting against segregation, they weren't afraid to go to jail because they were already in jail. So how are you going to scare me into going to jail when I'm literally in jail? How are you going to scare me, into dying when racism literally prevents me from living? And those are the messages that Malcolm conveyed. And so I want to talk to him more about that, his own fearlessness.
I heard you talk a lot about stereotypes. So my question to you is, to the people that contribute stereotypes and represent Black people in a negative way, how do you think we could change that? And do you believe that we could change that?
So, and I wrote a book called Stamped from the Beginning. And in this book, it really chronicled the history of stereotypes, or what I call in that book, racist ideas. And in that book, I distinguished between the producers of racist ideas, or the people who are creating the stereotypes, and people who are hearing them and internalizing them. So I wanted us to not necessarily think about the person who was watching the film, where Black people were said to be savages. I wanted people to think about the people who were creating the film, or the people who were giving the speech, or the people who were writing that essay, or that creating that science, or the theologian who was saying that Black people are the cursed descendants of Ham, so we should be enslaved forever. I wanted to think about the people, again, creating and producing these ideas. And what I found is that these were people who were producing these ideas because they justified policies that benefited them. So, in other words, slavery and being able to enslave Black people and make them work and not pay them allows me to get rich. So now I'm going to create ideas or stereotypes that say that these people should be enslaved because they're Black. And then people are going to consume those ideas. And then they're not going to challenge slavery because they're going to be like, Black people should be enslaved because they're Black. And then that's going to allow me, the enslaver, to get rich. That's the producers of racist ideas. And I mention that because it is very, very hard to get those people to stop producing these ideas because these ideas justify the policies that help them, that allow them to get rich, that allow them to get powerful. So what we need to do is get rid of those people, push them out of power, remove the policies, because that's the only way in which we're going to prevent the production of these ideas, if that makes sense.
If there was one book you had to choose to like explain your ideas for like everyone in the world to read, which book would it be and why?
Well, I would say How to Be an Anti-Racist would be that book. We have some. Yes.
My question was like just how you just said that. You said these people, we need to push them out. How would we do that without violence?
So let me give an example. There are three different types of these folks. So one of the things that's happening right now is Target decided that they were going to eliminate their DEI program. And so a number of Black organizations came together and organized a boycott of Target. This boycott has led to a number of, basically Target is making far less money right now than they did before. It recently came out that the CEO of Target, so this is a powerful person, his wages are getting cut because the company is making less money. And so now you have a situation in which the shareholders of Target, the executives of Target, have two choices. Either they continue to resist reinstituting anti-racist policies and programs across the company, or they continue to lose money. So the way that protests works, even nonviolent protests, is they put pressure on power to change, in which power begins to see, you know what, it's actually in my own interest to change. And so there actually have been nonviolent protests that have succeeded in that way. To give another example, many of you are probably familiar with those images of those Black people in Birmingham being hit with water hoses in 1963. So these were actually young people who marched downtown while Martin Luther King and others were there protesting against segregation in Birmingham. And because of those marches and because of that violence, those downtown businesses weren't making money. And Martin Luther King actually decided that they were going to do those marches on Easter. Why? Because aside from Christmas, these companies make a lot of money on Easter. So those companies were like, okay, all these demonstrations and protests are like literally affecting my bottom line. So then they came to the table and agreed to a desegregation pact so that people would come back to their stores. So there are many different forms of pressure that you can put on power. One form is violence. There are other sort of nonviolent forms, and they're typically protests. And let me also say that there's a difference between a protest and a demonstration. A demonstration is when we, let's say, march or we engage in a rally and we speak out against people being disappeared, immigrants being disappeared right now. That, of course, can get bad press for the government, but it doesn't put direct pressure as like a boycott, as an example would. And so there are techniques that people have used that have then led to transformations, and those are two examples. Yes.
How did Malcolm X's concept of freedom by any means necessary both challenge white America and the civil rights movement?
Well, it's interesting you asked this question right after we talk about sort of violence as a strategy, because I think that Malcolm X didn't necessarily take violence off the table. So he, for instance, one of his most famous speeches in 1964 was called "The Ballot or the Bullet," in which he basically argued that there will be a revolution. There should be a revolution in 1964. Will that revolution come through the ballot or the bullet? He wanted it to come through the ballot, but if it doesn't come necessarily through the ballot, then there will be other sort of means. And as you would imagine, there were a lot of people, even including amount of white Americans and even including Black Americans, who were very scared, of that type of talk. And so for him, he was incredibly focused on freedom. One of his most salient sort of quotes is he said that, and he was directly challenging those who basically completely took violence off the table. He basically said that a person who, in one breath, will say they want freedom, and then the very next breath will tell you all the things they won't do to get their freedom, is a person who actually doesn't really want freedom. And so that is how he conceived of, like, by any means necessary. I actually can think of, he can think of a particular strategy, let's say if that strategy is nonviolent or a form of self-defense, as potentially the best strategy. But he's also not necessarily, he's going to think of what's the best strategy, not necessarily what strategy is the most politically acceptable strategy. And I think that's what distinguished Malcolm X from other people at that time. Back here and then here.
Okay, so basically my question's based off of the documentary. So when Senator Davis, I believe is his name, talks about the land of Zod, I was wondering if that's his own personal belief of how Black people originated, or if that was a collective mindset of the people that had power in the early rise of America. And a follow-up question is do you believe if the land of Zod, that mindset was never created or came to be, would there be less racism, bigotry, systematic redlining, and racism in America?
So that was actually a widely held belief. So it was widely held in the 1800s that different races we're literally different species. So you know how like cats and dogs are different species of being, like they can't cohabitate and have children together. They're literally separate species. So too did people believe that, let's say, Black people and Asian people and white people were different species. And to the point in which they believed that when Black people and white people had a child together, that child, that biracial child, they called a mulatto. And the root of mulatto is mule. A mule is an animal that literally can't have children. And so this was widely believed. It was called polygenesis. So there's monogenesis. We all come from, let's say, Adam and Eve, if you're Christian, or we all come from the same pair in Africa, if you're thinking from a more secular standpoint. So all humans are one. We come from the same origin story. And then there's polygenesis, which is Black people originated in Africa, and we are a different species than white people who apparently originated in Europe, and so on. Now, it goes completely against science, and it goes against evolutionary theory, but that's what people believed. And they believed that that is why the quote unquote Black species, of course, they imagined was destined forever to slavery. And so it was actually Senator Davis's statement was widely held and widely believed, at that time by some of the top American intellectuals who were teaching at colleges like University of Pennsylvania and Harvard and Stanford. And obviously those ideas were not true.
Yeah, I got one right here. So the statement, how can we be Black and proud and be called the N-word at the same time? What do you feel about the use of the N-word with all the youth of today throughout the schools? You hear one another, you hear them calling one another that, not only just from a perspective of Black folk, but just all the students. How do you feel about that, and how would you address that?
So it is actually, so what young people will say is they see the way that they use the term, they see it differently than, let's say, the way a Klansman would use the term. And that the way they use the term is a term of more so like endearment. That's my guy. While obviously the way that Klansmen or white supremacists would use the term is, that's my quote enemy. That is like a predator. That's somebody I hate. And young people would also say that they have transformed the meaning of the term, and thereby the way, even the sort of way that the term is even spelled. I'm mentioning this because it's actually it's very, very complicated. And the reason why it's complicated is because I actually agree with both positions. So I actually would argue that people shouldn't necessarily be using the term, even in its renovated and transformed way. But then I would also recognize that there were terms that were connotations for the N-word that Black people are now widely using, like Black. So Black, like literally to call somebody Black in 1955 was almost equivalent to calling them the N-word. But Black people transformed the meaning of that term, particularly Black people like Malcolm X. And so, but on the other hand, that term didn't necessarily carry the type of violent baggage that the N-word carried. So there's differences there. So like, I'm saying this because it's an argument and it's a discussion and it's a debate. And I think it's something we should continue to engage about, but I just don't want to deny that other terms have actually been transformed. So to give an example, the B word has been transformed. And so you have literally feminists who are using the B word in a way that sort of removes it from its derogatory sense. So it's a little bit more complicated. And I just wanted to speak to those complications. But at the same time, if a young person is like, I don't appreciate the use of that word, or an older person says, I don't think y'all should be using that word, I'm going to agree with them. But if a young person argues back, well, feminists have sort of retaken the B word, and Black people, I can't deny that, right? So that's sort of my position on that. Well, the B word did get you killed. I mean, there's a lot of women who are no longer living because right before they were called the B word. Definitely.
Sorry about that. That's for a later conversation, the B word. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you and give you a compliment. So I'm president of the Denver Council PTSA. And one of the things that I required that people that are on the board do is read and have a discussion about the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I was one of one at the time. I was the only Black person that was on the board at the time. Now we have 3 or 4 Black people that are on the board, because I think it's important for Black people to see themselves in positions of authority and leadership. But I just wanted to thank you for writing that book, because what that did is, it's not that we didn't have pushback, because there were people like, well, why do we have to do this? And why is it always about race? But at the same time, what it did is it showed people how to step into understanding what their privilege was, so we could move forward in a more positive manner. So I want to thank you for that.
And thank you for your work.
Thank you, schools, for coming. I know everything was kind of last minute, but I have to say you all did phenomenal. I'm so proud of DPS and the schools that are present. Thank you, Dr. Kendi, for just taking the time to speak to the students. They definitely prepared. So super excited. You all, as you're walking out, please take one book. It is signed by Dr. Kendi, and read it, then pass it on. It's a phenomenal book. I literally read it in like 2 days. It's a very easy read. But thank you all for coming. Head back and have a good rest of the day. Enjoy y'all summer. And you guys are phenomenal.
I know we're on time.
Okay, before you guys all head out, I almost forgot. Is it okay if we take a group picture?